going to stop sharing my screen. And everyone can see me, correct? Can I get a thumbs up from Colleen if you can just see me? Okay, great. Okay, so welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Rebecca Kolarich, and I am the Water Program Manager at Environmental Defense. So this evening, we will be talking about the implications of the recently passed Bill 5 and explore our next steps together. So tonight we will be hearing from some folks in the Dresden area, one of the first communities impacted by Bill 5. There, they continue to fight against the development of a dump that threatens the Sydenham River and nearby communities, slated to be built without a thorough environmental assessment and without community input. So firstly, I would just like to start with a land acknowledgement. So I am located in Toronto, the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa and the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and what is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. So now I would just like to touch on some housekeeping rules for tonight. So if you have any questions during the presentation, please input them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to those questions during our Q&A portion of the webinar, which will be near the end. So if you have any difficulties, please send Hasanika or Colleen a private DM in the chat. If you would like closed captions, you could turn those on at the bottom of your Zoom screen. This is also going to be a recorded webinar and will be posted onto our YouTube channel. So you're able to go back and rewatch or share with anyone who wasn't able to make it this evening. We will also send a link to the recording and any of the resources that were mentioned after this session. Our agenda for the night is going to look a little something like this. So we will first hear from Mariya Hoque, Public Interest Articling Fellow at Amnesty International, and she will give us a little bit of a background on Bill 5 from a human rights perspective. I will then come back on screen and introduce the situation in Dresden, how it came to be, how it's related to Bill 5, and how it is a case study for what could happen in other communities in the province. I'm then going to pass it on to Chief Leela Thomas from Walpole Island First Nation, and she will discuss the impacts of the dump from an Indigenous perspective. And then finally, we will hear from Chatham-Kent Councilor Rhonda Jubenville, who will talk about the impacts of the dump and what those would have on the surrounding environment and the community infrastructure, and also give a little bit of a historical background of Dresden. And at the end of the session, we will share some of our current calls to action and also hold a Q&A session. So with that, it is time to get started. So I'm going to now shine the spotlight on Mariya Hoque, Public Interest Articling Fellow with Amnesty International.
Oops. Hi, everyone. I hope that you can all see me and hear me fine. Thank you for inviting me to speak on behalf of Amnesty. My name is Mariya, and I'll be going over the impact of Bill 5 and the impact that it has on the rights of Indigenous people in particular. So I'll focus on Section 35 of the Constitution, the duty to consult, and the principle of free, prior, and informed consent under the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So just to briefly go over what the bill is about, the main initiative behind Bill 5 is to streamline approvals for development and infrastructure projects, including mining. Part 1 of the bill enacts the Free Trade and Labor Mobility in Canada Act, which establishes a framework to remove federal barriers to the interprovincial trade of goods and services. And this might mean that they might bypass a lot of regulations in place that were meant for safeguarding purposes. Part 2 of the bill enacts the Building Canada Act, which advances projects throughout Canada that are in the national interest, including projects that foster the development of economic and trade corridors. So Bill 5 faced a lot of criticism because it failed to include the involvement of Indigenous people. There have been proposed changes to acknowledge the duty to consult. However, Indigenous rights continue to be threatened. The Crown has a duty to consult with Indigenous groups when a decision is being contemplated that may affect their rights. This is an obligation that is not explicit in the legislation itself, but it's a common law principle and established by the Supreme Court of Canada in the case of Haida Nation versus British Columbia in 2004. So the case of Haida talks about good faith consultation, which reveals a duty to accommodate the concerns of Indigenous groups. But the government's desire to fast-track projects under Bill 5 may harm meaningful consultations. So I'll begin by talking about the threats around consultations when the government does not acknowledge the unique identities of Indigenous groups. Each First Nation group has its own sovereignty, legal and political system, as well as language. The bill, however, alludes to a generalizing of these groups when it doesn't acknowledge the unique identities of these communities and the ways that consultation processes and outcomes may differ as a result. Without this factor in mind, there are risks that the varying interest of each group will not be accommodated, and the overall respect for diversity and culture of Indigenous people is overlooked. Given that the purpose of the bill is to fast-track government projects, this significantly impairs the government's ability to give meaningful time and consideration to address the concerns and interests of every First Nation group, of which there are over 600. The timeframe for the exact meaning of fast-tracking projects, and if this timeframe is reasonable to incorporate the views of every First Nation group, needs to be clarified. The bill will also allow for the development of projects without applying factors of the Impact Assessment Act that evaluate the adverse impact on Indigenous rights. Section 16(2)(c) of the Impact Assessment Act clearly states that in making a decision about a project, the agency must take into account any adverse impact on Indigenous rights, as affirmed by Section 35 of the Constitution. Bill 5, however, says that this section that speaks of assessments will not apply in respect of a national interest and designated project. So we need to look at how consulting Indigenous groups and impact assessments on Indigenous rights go hand in hand. If the bill only acknowledges the duty to consult, but allows for the non-application of impact assessment provisions, the duty to consult ceases to have any meaningful purpose. A lack of impact assessment might mean that there is no way to mitigate adverse effects on Indigenous rights or prevent them from happening. In general, the principle of free, prior, and informed consent is not expressed throughout the bill. And this suggests that the duty to consult is not being tied to the purpose of balancing the interests of Indigenous people with that of the government. Rather, consultation is taking place for the sake of appearing as though an obligation is being fulfilled. But in reality, there is no deeper value and place for Aboriginal groups to be involved and included in these decisions, especially if there is the slightest chance that consent can be overridden. To finish off, within the body of this bill, there is no proposed legalized method to how consultation will be conducted practically. And this leads to the risks that consultation processes can be left to the discretion of the government. These methods may be changed and varied according to their discretion, and they may favor the government's needs, possibly triumphing the voices of Indigenous groups. And there has been a trend of the kind of issues that we see in Bill 5 have been similar to other bills that have been proposed across Canada, such as Bill 15, Infrastructure Projects Act of BC. And the similarities we see between these bills is that we only get bits and pieces of the picture, and there's a lack of overall transparency. And as a result, the trust between the government and Indigenous groups is affected, and it further hurts efforts for reconciliation. I think that's it for my time, and thank you so much.
Great. Thanks so much for that, Mariya. That was great and very informative. So now I'm going to just take a couple of minutes to provide some background on the specific case in Dresden. So as some of you may already know, about a year ago, York 1 proposed a dump development in Dresden. And there was a lot of concern from the community around the potential impacts to the environment and the community itself, which we will get into more detail a bit later on in the webinar. So as a result of these concerns, environmental groups, Indigenous groups, and community groups came together to fight for the designation of an environmental assessment, which would allow for transparent and a comprehensive review of all the proposed impacts that the dump may have. So after a lot of hard work and dedication from the community, the Minister of the Environment, Conservation and Parks finally designated the dump for a full environmental assessment, which was a fantastic win and a step in the right direction. However, this has all recently changed with the passing of Bill 5 in Ontario, or Bill 5, the Protect Ontario by Unleashing Our Economy Act. This has given the Premier and his government sweeping powers to exempt any person or business from any law for any purpose. So this power grab paves the way for the government to fast track projects that benefit wealthy developers and donors, as they've done before. It spells disaster for the environment, it overrides Indigenous rights, and jeopardizes the health of our communities. So one of the first communities to be impacted by Bill 5 is Dresden in Chatham-Kent. So residents of Dresden continue to fight this dump development that threatens to leach toxins into the Sydenham River, an ecological gem home to at least 33 species at risk. And thanks to Bill 5, the dump is now set to go ahead without a thorough environmental assessment. So basically the government, they designated an environmental assessment, and then this bill, what it did is just took it away instantly, and doesn't allow for any input from the community. So I'm now going to pass the spotlight to Chief Leela Thomas of Walpole Island First Nation, and she will be speaking on the impacts that the proposed dump would have on the Indigenous rights and the downstream Indigenous communities.
Miigwech for the welcome there. I'm very honored to be part of this webinar today and to speak on the impacts to First Nations communities, in particular, Pequejinon First Nation. Magwada Tashinkwa Jishnikas Pequejinon Dujadaba Magwadodem. I'm Ogimakwa Chief Leela Thomas from Pequejinon unceded territory. And we've been very vocal about our opposition to Bill 5 and now Bill C5 ever since we found out about it. And luckily, we've had some support from Dresden Cares in terms of kind of guiding us and helping us lobby and reach government officials to express those concerns. What and I'm new to politics, so it was a big learning curve for myself. But and generally, just as a person in general, I like to give people the benefit of the doubt and try to see the good in people and try to you know talk to them and hopefully they will see some compassion and understanding on a person level and how things like this impact people. And we've been writing our MPPs and going up to Toronto and Ottawa, and it's very disappointing because it seems like their mind is made up no matter what we said, no matter how many people were there, or babies, little children, people of all ages. It's just very disappointing that like they didn't really care. They didn't want to hear the voices of the First Nations communities, and not only that, but towns like Dresden. So it was very disheartening to hear that, and we're very fortunate that we have some MPPs that are willing to go out there and advocate for us. So not only as it does it impact First Nations people, but Dresden Care or Dresden with the landfill. It's going to impact our drinking water, our fishing, our hunting, our overall health, because those leachants are going to go into Molly's Creek, which is going to go to the Sydenham River, and then down here to Walpole Island First Nation, and then into the Great Lakes. So we are impacted by that. Not only that, it's in our traditional territory. So um, Bill 5 and Bill C5 are both direct violations to the supreme law of the land, and we are deeply concerned by the Ontario and now the federal government's continued efforts to push through legislation that oversteps our First Nations rights, sovereignty lands, and communities without consultation, transparency, and accountability. This legislation, as proposed, represents serious violation of the federal and provincial government's duty to consult and accommodate First Nations. I think that's very important to make that distinction, that they have a duty to consult, but also to accommodate. And if there's time later, I'll go into what that accommodation would look like. And that is a foundational legal and constitutional obligation established by the Supreme Court of Canada and grounded in our treaties and to nation relationship. And we go with our Anishinaabe law. It's the supreme law of the land, and it predates and supersedes colonial legal frameworks imposed on First Nation territories. So our law is inseparable from the land. Laws and teachings are drawn from nature's natural cycles, animal behavior, seasons, sacred places, and therefore land is seen not just as property, but as a living legal being that instructs human conduct and how the decisions that we make and how it impacts future generations. We consider treaties to be solemn promises of mutual obligation, to be nation-to-nation agreements to share land and resources and allow for non-native settlement. The spirit and intent of these treaties have created obligations for both the British Crown and our First Nations, including stewardship. So we never agreed to overdevelopment, poisoning of our waters, raping the land of our resources, and desecrating our sacred sites. We feel like Canada's treaty relationship has international significance because of early treaties that were between First Nations and British Imperial Crown. In the early 1980s, First Nation representatives, they traveled to Britain to protest of Canada's plans to patriate the Constitution, and that threatened to sever the treaty relationship. And Lord Denning, in a ruling for the English Court of Appeal, affirmed that patriation did not diminish the Crown's responsibility to honor our treaty obligations. And he ruled that no parliament should do anything to lessen the worth of these guarantees, these treaties, and that they should be honored by the Crown in respect of Canada. And he later declared that the ruling should help First Nations withstand any onslaught from the government of Canada. Like it's been mentioned, Bill 5 and now Bill C5 proposes to fast track these major infrastructure and development projects across Canada by centralizing decision-making power in the hands of one individual. And it allows them to unilaterally approve projects, overriding existing regulatory protections and bypass environmental and social impact assessments, all without returning to government for further approval, review or approval. And this is very not only undemocratic, but it impacts First Nations inherent treaty rights and sovereignty. It impacts our lands, our waters, our ways of life, and it's frightening because they don't lay out explicitly in this bill what they are going to be doing. So right now it is sort of theoretical, but we have experience working with government and these laws that they pass, that it's very real just based on history and what we've had to go through and endure, that we feel it's not theoretical, that it's real and it's going to impact us, the whole of the province and all of Canada. So, like it was mentioned, it contravenes Canadian law and specifically the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and which requires free, prior, and informed consent on matters that affect First Nations people. And, you know, there's treaties, the Royal Proclamation of 1763, the Treaty of Niagara of 1764, that affirmed our relationship of mutual respect and consent and partnership between First Nations and the Crown. And again, it seems like every so often, government doesn't learn from history, and they try to pass through bills that would override our inherent treaty rights. And First Nations, you know, will always assert their rights, and they will continue to do that. Just like any other person out there that has a legal binding obligation and commitment to that's outstanding, that's withstanding time, that people would assert those rights. And that's basically what First Nations are doing. And it's scary because they say they are going to consult with us after the fact. Well, this bill passed in York 1, that's going to be proposed, that's doing this landfill in Dresden, hasn't really consulted with us a year ago. And I've been here 8 months and they haven't contacted me. They're coming and making a presence there in Dresden, and they still haven't consulted us. And to ask of proponents to do that all across Ontario and Canada, it's unrealistic. Like, I don't know how they're going to monitor and make sure that every proponent is doing the consultation. So we're very deeply concerned about this and the impacts that it will have on our sovereignty. And I know I'm going by a big chunk of my time, so I'll pass it on from here.
No, that was great. Thank you so much for that, Leela. And now I'm going to pass it off to Councilor Rhonda Jubenville, who will be detailing the environmental and municipal impacts of the dump and also give us a brief history of her town and community. So Rhonda, Spotlight is on you now.
Thank you very much. And thank you to Environmental Defense for including me in your webinar. I appreciate that. And to get the word out and the information about how this is impacting our community. So this is the municipality of Chatham-Kent, and Dresden is a city in the municipality of Chatham-Kent. And Dresden is where this potential landfill is going to be coming in. So just on a personal note, despite strong Indigenous and municipal community opposition to Bill 5, as we all know, it unfortunately passed. I was disappointed and disheartened to hear of its passing. I was saddened that our elected Conservative MPPs, especially the two local ones, Chatham-Kent actually sits within two electoral ridings, Chatham-Kent-Leamington and Lambton-Kent-Middlesex, and both of our MPPs are Conservative MPPs. And unfortunately, neither of them stood against this bill. So I am disappointed that one voted and one was absent for the final vote on Bill 5. It's just disappointing because they both know how this will affect and threaten Dresden and the community around it. But I am hopeful that they will still work with us to provide the best possible outcome in this unfortunate situation. In my opinion, the best outcome would be to repeal the entire bill, but we'll have to see where that goes. What is most concerning to me is in this bill was the full removal of the environmental assessment, which we thought we had, but when the bill came in, it removed the environmental assessment. That would have provided all of the safeguards that we would have needed to make sure that this project would proceed in an environmentally sound direction. I do worry for the people of Dresden. It's very close to the town limits, less than, basically the property that they have purchased is across the road from the town. So the Welcome to Dresden sign is across the road from part of the agricultural property that they have purchased. So it is very, very, very close. It's not some piece of agriculture, agricultural land that is 5 kilometers away from the city. It's literally right there. So the impact on the land, the farms, the tributaries like the Sydenham River and Molly's Creek, the air, and all of the wildlife that call these places their home. It's very concerning. I'm going to continue to work with Chatham-Kent Council to oppose the project. So we have taken a stand in opposition to this project. And I'm going to continue to be hopeful for a positive outcome. I have encouraged all people who are affected to continue to reach out to all MPPs, whether they're Conservative, NDP, Liberal. So basically the Conservatives voted in favor of it, but they have a majority. So the NDPs, the Liberals, the Greens, the Independent, they voted against the bill. But I encourage people to continue to reach out to all of them so that they know we're not going away. We are still in opposition to this, and we will do whatever we can in order to oppose this. And so Chatham-Kent Council put forth a motion right after the bill passed, and I'm just going to read it so that people know what Chatham-Kent is actively working on right now. I won't read the beginning of it because that's where all the whereas are, and so I'll just read the action items that Chatham-Kent is actively working on right now in response to Bill 5. So now, therefore, in support of all impacted citizens and businesses and impacted Indigenous nations, Chatham-Kent Council calls on the province to reverse its decision to permit a landfill just north of Dresden at 29831 Irish School Road without a full environmental assessment process. And if the province refuses to do so, Council calls on the province to A, require that a terms of reference be required at the outset of the project to ensure that the studies that would typically be required by the environmental assessment process be included in the decision-making on whether to authorize an amendment to the environmental compliance approval, specifically but not necessarily limited to studies related to ecological impacts, geotechnical, air, odor, gas modeling, noise, transportation, and socioeconomic impacts, and that the municipality be afforded the opportunity to review and provide input into the development of the terms of reference. And then also to ensure that the community engagement process that would occur in an environmental assessment process be included in the decision-making on whether to authorize an amendment to the environmental compliance approval to ensure that decision makers are aware of community impacts and concerns, and follow its duties for Indigenous consultation and accommodation with the impacted Indigenous nations. And that our Chatham-Kent administration be directed to return to Chatham-Kent Council with any steps that be taken to continue to defend Dresden and mitigate the impacts of this provincial decision, including administration be directed to connect with parties that may be challenging the law, including Indigenous nations impacted by the bill, and to consider the possibility of a court challenge. And that administration be directed to submit a request to the Federal Minister of the Environment and Climate Change for the landfill recycling project on Irish School Road to be designated as a project to which the Impact Assessment Act would apply on the basis of potential impacts to federally protected species habitat and potential impacts to Indigenous nations, and that administration be directed to pursue a review of the landfill recycling project under the Provincial Environmental Bill of Rights, and that they be directed to retain a traffic engineer to review impacts to roads and communities and our schools, because it's going through 2 school zones, potentially the traffic route from the York 1 proposal, and produce recommendations on how to mitigate these impacts if the project proceeds. And lastly, administration be directed to retain further experts to review environmental resources that could be impacted by this proposal, including ground and surface water, wetlands, species, and the natural environment. Here are some action items that we are presently working on, are being undertaken under by the municipality, especially since we've noticed that York 1 has moved some of their equipment onto their land. So they own the land, and within the last 2 weeks that we've noticed they've started moving some of their equipment, which they're entitled to do because they own the land. Just to be clear, York 1 has not come to the municipality of Chatham-Kent with any requests, any zoning applications or planning applications, or any offers. So they have not come to Chatham-Kent Council for anything. So they've basically bought property, and that's all that we know. The municipality has confirmed with York 1 what our position is under the Planning Act in that approvals are required for the proposed uses that York 1 has previously stated, and that these would require applications to Chatham-Kent Council. We have received no applications from York 1 thus far. We are actively connected and engaged with local Indigenous nations and our neighboring municipalities to continue dialogue on this contentious issue. Our bylaw enforcement officers have attended the York 1 own site on a few occasions since their trucks arrived, and they will continue to monitor the site for any bylaw or zoning infractions. We have sent correspondence to York 1 indicating this. Some of my high-level concerns are how the traffic, the truck traffic, the potential of 700 trucks a day will impact our municipality and the neighboring municipalities, how it will impact the infrastructure on our roads that have not been built to sustain this level of traffic. It's a farming community, so there will be at times an influx of farming and implement traffic, and also bus traffic. Like I said, there are 2 schools very nearby to the site. We don't know, there is no ability to process the leachate within the municipality, so we have no idea how they're going to do that. Like I said, they've not come to council with any zoning applications or requested any building permits. The 2 schools that I mentioned do not have traffic lights. They are just school zones that decreased speeds. But if that is the proposed route for these trucks, it's very concerning what will happen if these trucks are driving through 2 school zones. There is a buffer zone that is required that the proponent needs to own and control the surrounding areas. They currently do not own the buffer area, nor do they have any agreements in place with the neighboring property owners. Buffer zones are needed under the legislation to ensure contaminant control, testing of groundwater, prohibits neighboring landowners from using water wells, changing and altering buildings on their property. Under legislation, the proponent must own the buffer land or have agreements in place with the owners, and to date, no such agreements exist. The site is a designated wetland and flood zone with the Carolinian Forest Zone that is home to over 88 endangered species and federally protected spawning grounds. Ontario landfill regulations prohibits construction of landfills within these areas without thorough, comprehensive environmental assessments. And generally because of the intrinsic dangers of flooding and contamination of leachates across vulnerable wetlands. The St. Clair Conservation Authority, which is the local authority, has worked diligently over decades to heal and remediate the damage done by historic, unregulated industrial discharge into the local Sydenham River. A 1967 St. Clair Conservation Report on water quality remediation showed 2 to 3 kilometers of deoxygenated dead zones downstream from industries. The makeup of the river's fine silt content enabled chemical bonding with discharged materials, which killed sections of the river and its ability to support aquatic life. A similar principle to soil washing. Chemicals and heavy metals bond with water, and the silty clay water during soil washing, which is an extreme remediation process. With plans to directly discharge wastewater into the 4th Concession, Irish School Road, Ditch, and Molly's Creek, which all drain into the Sydenham River, it will undermine the progress made by the St. Clair Conservation Authority. Today, the Sydenham River has recovered and is now home to many at-risk and endangered species, like I mentioned. In Dresden alone, there are these endangered species. Walpole Island is home to over 700 species of birds, fish, insects, etc., many of whom are found nowhere else in Canada. Additionally, a fun fact, the Sydenham River is part of the Great Lakes Basin feeder system that provides drinking water for more than 40 million people along the Great Lakes Basin and continues to be a sacred river since 1801, when the first baby of color born free out of slavery was baptized in the Sydenham River waters, and it continues to be used in the Dresden Baptist Church for holy baptism. So in conclusion, there are so many concerns that I have and Chatham-Kent Council has and residents of Dresden and Chatham-Kent at large have with regards to this project. I am disheartened it has come to this point, but I will continue to work with Chatham-Kent Council to do all we can to protect Dresden and its people. Thank you.
Great. Awesome. Thank you so much, Rhonda. So before we get into the Q&A session, I just wanted to highlight that Dresden is just one of potentially many cases that could happen anywhere in Ontario with this new Bill 5. This is why it's crucial to raise our voices province-wide and let the government know that environmental protections aren't red tape. They're there for a reason, and they shouldn't just be removed just to benefit developers. We will be sharing a call to action for folks to sign and send a letter to the government and key decision makers asking them to repeal Bill 5 entirely and redesignate the Dresden dump for a full environmental assessment. We will also share a document that outlines how you can call your MPP if folks are interested in getting on the phone with them, and we will highlight specific talking points that you can use as well. So we will begin our Q&A session now. I am just going into the box to see. We have one Q&A session, question, sorry, not a Q&A session, from Connie. And she states, or she asks, if there's a legal way to fight this Bill 5, what can we do? I have signed petitions. And I might actually pass that on to local community group member, Stefan at Dresden Cared, because he has done a bunch of research on this, and it may be helpful to hear from a community member. So maybe I will pass that one off to Stefan.
Thank you, Rebecca. Good evening. Great question. There is a lot we can do, much like with the Greenbelt. Ontarians found out that through social pressure, the Premier was willing to backtrack and repeal the gutting of the Greenbelt for housing development. And so today in Dresden, as Merritt Stiles was speaking to our town in Repeal Bill 5 rally, you heard a unified voice of not just our community, and Councilor Jubenville mentioned that we have been working with all three opposition parties, including the independent, to ensure that our concerns are taken to Queen's Park, and a similar strategy to the Greenbelt strategy is employed. So the petitions to repeal Bill 5, yes, please keep signing them and sending them into Queen's Park or to us. We can facilitate getting that to the official opposition, who will enter that and present it. But you know, wherever you are in Ontario, reach out to the local groups and organizations in your riding. Check the ERA website to ensure that there aren't any projects being snuck into your community. And so the first part is being aware. The second part is reaching out to the opposition members, letting them know that you do care about having Bill 5 repealed, and they will continue to add the political pressure while people like Chief Leela and myself go to court on different projects with different proponents.
Great. I don't see any. Someone is asking if we can have a map showing the Sydenham River, the Walpole Island First Nation, and the municipality of Chatham-Kent. So we can maybe find that for you and include it into a document and send it to you after. I also wanted to add that if you have another question after the webinar, you can send an email to either myself or engagement@environmentaldefense.ca. And we are happy to forward any questions that you may have that were either missed or came to mind after the webinar, and we can forward those to the right person to answer. I'm actually not seeing too many unanswered questions anymore. Rhonda?
I just wanted to respond to the person who was asking for a map. I don't have a map, but I have something that I could propose for, I think it was Linda that asked for it. So it was a very useful tool that our mayor and myself and my colleague, the other councilor in this ward, we actually walked from the site, from the proposed landfill site, and we walked through to Dresden. We crossed over the Sydenham, and it really put things in great context for people. So I don't know, Linda, if you're on Facebook, if you want to look at our mayor's Facebook, his name is Darren Caniff, and it's spelled Darrinn, and his last name is Caniff, Canniff. And on May 23rd, there was a video taken of us walking. And so they advanced it a little bit, but it really puts things in perspective of how close the dump is. And he discusses as we cross over the Sydenham, and there's a couple different areas that we stop and we discuss. So it's a good tool if you want to really see where this is and how close it is to the tributaries and how close it is to the town. So that's just a recommendation if you want to spend the time to look it up. That was all. Thank you.
Great.
Just to build on that, actually on Chatham-Kent's municipal website, there is a GIS map that does show Dresden, Chatham-Kent, as well as Walpole Island, which we can share with Rebecca, and she could pass that on to everyone.
Great. One more question. Can we hear more about accommodation that goes with the duty to consult? Leela, maybe that is a question for you.
Sorry, just taking off my unmuting myself there. So typically we've had a consultation protocol established going back to, I believe, 2004. So we've had this for a long time. And what usually happens is there's some sort of like pre-engagement where the proponent would come to us and say, hey, we want to do this in your territory. And based on that, we would determine, um, you know, if it needs to do, if there's more engagement that has to be done. And then from that, we would determine if it has to go on to more consultation and accommodation. So it's not just a one-time meeting, and and we're giving the okay on it. And I think that's the confusion with a lot of proponents is like, well, I met with them. I consulted with them. I talked to them. And we fulfilled our obligation for duty to consult, and that's not the case. So accommodation will generally include us hearing about, the project in full, having the capacity to um, have our environmentalist or our lawyers or our staff to look at the project in full and see if there was impacts to the environment, to our hunting and fishing and to species at risk. So we are given the opportunity to figure out what those impacts are, and without that, we can't really call that accommodation because or consultation, because we need to know what the full impacts are. And with that, we would do our due diligence and figure out, okay, well, we've highlighted, with Dresden, let's say Dresden dump, we figure out like, well, there's the aquifers and the species at risk, and it's in a floodplain, all this stuff. And we would highlight like, okay, well, you're gonna have to do these prevention measures, these remediation measures to limit the impacts to like I said, the environment, hunting, fishing, species at risk, and to our livelihood. And they would have to figure out a plan to mitigate those impacts. And usually that would also provide, like some proponents that really know what they're doing, they will also provide capacity building, because when a proponent is coming doing an activity in our traditional territory, it's using up our resources. Again, these treaties aren't it's not about we're not giving up the land, we're not giving up the resources. So they're coming here and taking the resources that were supposed to be shared. So they have to provide capacity building, because it's impacting us. So they're giving us the money to hire who we want, to hire our lawyers, our environmentalists, to double check their work. And so that would be a capacity building that they would provide for us, because it's an inconvenience on us. Because, and then we'd have to, we would do that ourselves. And then we would come back and saying, hey, this is based on what our experts say. These are the impacts, and this is what are we wanting. And usually too, that would involve some sort of compensation, whether that be some equity sharing, or sometimes they give some community benefit to the First Nation that can be used for whatever they would like to build up the community. So there's a lot of stuff that's involved, a lot of steps involved in the consultation and accommodation. And it's important to note that, like, you have to do both. You can't just consult and that's it, one meeting and you're done. It's a process, and it's built over time. So hopefully I answered your question.
I think we only have time for one more question, but I just want to repeat myself that if your question wasn't answered, please send either myself or engagement@environmentaldefense.ca your question, and we will have it answered to you by next week. We just can't get through all of them today because we will run out of time. So this question, I think this is going to be a good question for Dresden Cared. Someone is asking if there are any more rallies throughout the summer and fall.
That is an amazing question. Today was the kickoff to our summer events. We have a few things planned. On the 12th and 13th of this month, we are planning a dinner with the farmers and a couple political leaders. On the 13th, we are doing a sacred fire ceremony, sunrise followed by a sacred water walk. But we're doing it as a canoe paddle down the Sydenham River. And so that's always a great opportunity to join in and participate. And as we move into the summer, we are looking at other dates and to team up with other communities who are doing things because there is strength in numbers, and Dresden is just a tiny town of 3,000 people. So we will be sharing that on social media as more of our planning gets underway. But great question. Thank you.
Okay, actually, maybe we'll do one more. And this also might be a question for you, Stefan, but we'll try and make it quick. Brian asked, I know you have been working with the Conservation Authority. So Brian asked, does the Conservation Authority have regulatory input here? Yes or no?
Great question. Because the site backs on to wetland and conservation control by the Sinclair Conservation Authority, under the Federal Environmental Assessment Act, it does give the conservation authorities the power to act and create setbacks. And the interesting thing about that federal EA around renewable energy projects, it sets a setback of, I believe, 50 to 120 meters from the drip line of a tree, which means it's the edge of the last leaf on a tree where water falls off of. They would have to set their berms and their operations anywhere between 50 and 120 meters back from that. And so we are actively working to lobby the federal government to drop 2 environmental assessments. One is the impact assessment around the landfill. The second is around the renewable energy project that York 1 has sort of snuck into the paperwork that a lot of people have ignored. And so we are hoping that even though the province has gutted the Sinclair Conservation Authority, the federal government under that legislation would give them more power to act and protect the environment and the species at risk.
Great. Thanks for that, Stefan. That was awesome. Okay, so again, if your question wasn't answered, please send us an email and we will get it answered for you by next week. So now I'm just going to close it off. So thank you all so much for joining us this evening, and a huge thank you to our speakers. Again, this is just one case of potentially many here in Dresden. And it's really important to start at the local level and raise our voices province-wide. It is our best chance to stand up for our rights all across Ontario. We will be sharing a link to this webinar for you if you would like to rewatch or send it to anyone who may have missed it. And again, we will also be sharing our call to action, which will link to a letter to sign and we'll send to Premier Ford, the Minister of Environment, Conservation and Parks, Todd McCarthy, and it will also CC your MPPs to urge them to repeal the bill and redesignate the Dresden dump for a full environmental assessment. Additionally, we will share a document that outlines how you can call your MPPs and some helpful points to bring up during that conversation. Environmental protections are there for a reason. They are not red tape, and they should not just be freely removed for the sake of wealthy developers. One more time, if you have any questions that weren't answered, please send us an email. We will get back to you. I do think Colleen dropped the email in the chat, but we can also send that to you later on. And thanks again for joining us this evening. It's been wonderful, and it was wonderful to hear from all of our speakers. And that concludes our webinar. So thank you so much.